What if, one ordinary evening, your entire city suddenly went dark, but your block stayed lit like a tiny island in a sea of shadows? What if the traffic lights at the end of your street blinked out? The towers on the skyline disappeared. And yet your home, your grocery store, and the clinic down the road kept humming along as if nothing had happened? Would you still think of electricity as something distant and abstract? Or would you start asking why your small patch of light survived when everything else failed? Now imagine that this isn't a science fiction scene, but a glimpse into the way power failures are already unfolding. In recent years, massive blackouts have turned modern cities into survival zones. Pipes froze, food spoiled, hospitals scrambled to keep critical equipment running. In other places, utilities have deliberately cut power to entire regions for hours or days just to avoid starting wildfires. Why is a system we consider modern still so vulnerable to a single storm, a heat wave, or a downed transmission line? And if we have the technology to keep at least some communities powered through chaos, why isn't that the default instead of the exception? Here's where the real puzzle begins. The traditional grid was built for a different era when weather was more predictable, demand was smaller, and electricity only flowed one way, from a few giant plants down long lines into passive homes and buildings. But the world has changed faster than the wires above our heads. Climate extremes are hitting harder. Our reliance on electricity is exploding. And even the digital systems that control the grid are now targets for cyber attacks. The strange part is that, while we keep patching the same fragile structure, a quieter revolution is already showing us another path. Small, smart, local grids that can stand on their own when the big system stumbles. What happens when those little grids stop being side projects and start becoming the backbone of how we power our lives? Welcome to the Hidden Why, where your curiosity finds its answers. Today, we're going to explore why microgrids are becoming the new energy grid and what that shift means for your home, your community, and the future of energy itself. To understand why microgrids matter, we first have to confront the uneasy truth about the system we rely on right now. The conventional power grid is like a giant tree with a single trunk, impressive when it's standing, but dangerously fragile when the wind picks up. A storm in one state can knock out power for millions of people. A heat wave can push demand so high that operators are forced to plead with customers to turn off their air conditioners. A single failure in a key substation can ripple across hundreds of miles. Why are we comfortable living with a system where one broken link can cascade into a regional crisis? Why do we act surprised when a once-in-a-decade storm suddenly becomes a once-every-few-years event and the grid buckles under the pressure? But here's the twist. Many of these disasters don't happen because we lack power plants. They happen because we can't get electricity where it needs to go. When parts of the system fail, long, exposed transmission lines cross mountains, forests, and coasts, turning high winds and ice into enemies of reliability. The strange part is that in some cases, utilities now preemptively shut off power to entire areas to prevent those lines from sparking fires or collapsing. If the safest option is to turn everything off, can we really call that a resilient system? Most people never realize that the risk isn't just about how much electricity we can generate. It's about how centralized and brittle the delivery system has become. And if the stakes keep rising from frozen pipes to wildfire evacuations, how long can we keep pretending that a century-old design is good enough? This is exactly where microgrids step in, not as a gadget or a backup generator, but as a fundamentally different way to think about power. A microgrid is a local energy network, a neighborhood, a campus, a base, an industrial park that can generate its own electricity, store it, and, when necessary, disconnect from the big grid and operate on its own. Think of it as a community deciding to breathe with its own lungs, instead of relying on one distant pair shared by millions. Why should your hospital depend on wires stretching over mountains when it can draw power from panels on its own roofs and batteries in its own parking lot? Why should a coastal town wait days for damaged lines to be rebuilt when it could keep the lights on locally from day one? Here's what almost nobody is talking about. Microgrids aren't just collections of solar panels and batteries. They're orchestrated systems controlled by software that makes real-time decisions about where power flows, distributed generation rooftop solar, small wind turbines, fuel cells, or efficient generators, feeds electricity into the local network. Battery storage catches the excess when the sun is blazing and releases it when clouds roll in or demand spikes. Smart inverters and control systems act like traffic cops, balancing voltage and frequency, so the lights don't flicker, even when the grid outside the microgrid is in chaos. But almost nobody knows that a well-designed microgrid can transition from being connected to standing alone in a matter of milliseconds faster than you can blink. And once your community learns, it can operate independently. Do you ever see electricity as something distant and untouchable again? The impact of this shift is much bigger than keeping the power on during a storm. Microgrids radically change the math of reliability, cost, and sustainability all at once. By generating power close to where it's used, they reduce the energy lost, pushing electricity over long distances. That can lower costs and make communities less dependent on volatile fuel markets. But here's the twist. This local control also makes it much easier to integrate clean energy at higher levels than the traditional grid can comfortably handle. When a microgrid can coordinate solar, wind, and storage in real time, it doesn't just tolerate renewables, it thrives on them. Most people never realize that the real limit to clean energy isn't just how many panels we install. It's whether our local systems are smart enough to balance that energy minute by minute. The strange part is that microgrids also open up new ways to think about value. Instead of paying purely for consumption, communities can be rewarded for helping stabilize the larger grid, selling power back during peak demand, or providing backup services when the main system is stressed. Here's what almost nobody is talking about. A resilient microgrid isn't just a safety blanket. It can be an active player, earning revenue and reducing bills over time. If your neighborhood could both keep the lights on during a crisis and actually get paid for supporting the broader grid, wouldn't that change how you think about investing in local energy? And if enough of these smart islands appear, do we still think of the grid as one giant machine, or as a network of cooperating communities? All of this would still be theory if microgrids only existed on PowerPoint slides, but they don't. Around the world, microgrids are already protecting hospitals, university campuses, military bases, remote villages, and industrial facilities. When large grids have gone down, some of these microgrids have quietly stayed online, powering operating rooms, refrigeration units, water pumps, and communications, while everything around them went dark. Why aren't those stories as famous as the disasters themselves? Why do we mostly hear about the failures, not the places that rode out the storm with barely a flicker? But here's the twist. Microgrids are no longer just niche projects in remote areas. They're spreading into suburbs, city districts, and even data center clusters that can't afford a second of downtime. Most people never realize that, behind the scenes, a growing share of the world's most critical digital infrastructure servers that power AI, finance, and cloud services is being designed around microgrids to guarantee uptime. The strange part is that while many households still think of backup as a flashlight and a few candles, entire industries are quietly shifting toward local energy independence because they've done the math and decided that relying solely on the old grid is just too risky. If the companies handling the world's data no longer trust the traditional grid on its own, should ordinary communities be any less cautious? Of course, nothing. This transformative comes without hurdles. Microgrids can be expensive upfront, especially when you combine advanced controls, storage, and on-site generation. Regulations in many regions were written for a world where power only flowed one way and utilities owned almost everything that mattered. Why would a rulebook designed decades ago easily accommodate neighborhoods that want to own their own infrastructure, share power among multiple buildings, or trade electricity with their neighbors? Most people never realize that some of the biggest obstacles are not technical but legal and financial interconnection rules, tariff structures, and questions about who gets paid for what. But here's what almost nobody is talking about. Those barriers are starting to crack. Governments and regulators are rolling out pilot programs and incentives for community microgrids, especially in areas hit hard by storms, wildfires, or chronic outages. New financing models are emerging where third-party developers build and operate microgrids so communities don't have to pay all the costs up front. The strange part is that once a few successful projects prove their worth, showing that they can keep critical services running and lower lifetime costs, other communities move from "is this possible?" to "why don't we have this already?" If the rules are changing, the technology is ready, and the economics are improving. The real question becomes, how long will it take before microgrids shift from rare exceptions to normal expectations? Right now, we're living through an overlap between two worlds. One is the old, centralized grid, still huge, still essential, but increasingly strained by climate change, electrification, and aging infrastructure. The other is a new, decentralized landscape of microgrids, rooftop solar, batteries, and local energy communities. Most people never realize that both worlds are running at the same time, like two operating systems on the same machine. But here's the twist. With every new microgrid that comes online, the balance shifts a little more toward a networked future where no single failure can knock everything out. The strange part is that in this future, reliability doesn't come from trusting one giant system. It comes from thousands of smaller systems that can back each other up. So the deeper message is this: microgrids aren't just a clever technical fix. They're a new way for communities to claim agency over something we've always treated as distant and mysterious. They turn electricity from an invisible service into a shared, local responsibility. They invite neighborhoods to ask hard questions about resilience, fairness, and sustainability, and then actually act on the answers. Most people never realize that asking, "Why did the power fail?" is only the first step. The more important question is, what do we want our energy system to look like next time? And if we can design that system ourselves, right where we live, why would we settle for anything less? In the end, the choice isn't between the old grid and microgrids as competing enemies. It's about building a smarter, layered system where local strength supports regional stability, and vice versa. The strange part is that the future grid doesn't have to be a single fragile trunk. It can be a forest of interconnected, resilient trees. When the next big storm, heat wave, or cyber event hits, do you want to be one of the millions waiting for a distant control room to flip a switch, or part of a community that already has the power to keep its own lights on? That's why microgrids are becoming the new energy grid. and why the real question going forward isn't, will they matter? But, how soon will you be living in one?
Every question hides a reason. Every answer reveals a story. If this one made you see the world a little differently, give it a like. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden why behind our world, hit subscribe and stay curious.